Before the bombs ever fell, pre-war America built a nuclear bomb small enough to hold in one hand. It built a war robot the size of an office building and a virus that turned its own soldiers into monsters. The war lasted 2 hours. All of it is still out there, still armed. And the last one that went off wasn't fired by a soldier, it was set off by a courier delivering a package he never opened. So, what actually happened to every superweapon in Fallout? Above the Mojave, there's a weapon in New Vegas that can incinerate an entire army from orbit, and most players walk right past the building that controls it. That building is Helios 1, and to the eye it's just a big pre-war solar plant the NCR is fighting to keep running for electricity. But that was always the cover story, because underneath the power company logo, Helios was a research site for the US Army's top-secret energy weapons program, and the thing it was hiding is called Archimedes. Archimedes is an orbital laser, a satellite platform built by Poseidon Energy that can fire a focused beam of the sun's own energy down onto any target on the ground. And you can turn it on, because if you stand on the observation deck and work the controls, you can call that beam down on the NCR troops outside, wiping out an entire detachment in a single silent flash from a machine nobody down there even knows is up there. And the game makes you feel the weight of it through one companion. If Arcade Gannon is traveling with you when you fire Archimedes, he doesn't just disapprove. He leaves the party on the spot and runs to try and shut it down himself, because he grew up around the people that the beam is frying, and he knows exactly what he's watching. You press a button to see what it does, and a man who's seen the aftermath decides he'd rather fight you than let you finish. That reaction is the only alarm system a weapon this dangerous has left. Here's the part that tells you everything about the pre-war world. When the Army first tested Archimedes, the power draw was so violent it browned out half the region, frying systems as far away as the Black Mountain radio array and the bunkers at Hidden Valley. They built a weapon so hungry that testing it once knocked out the neighborhood, and then they built a second one, Archimedes 2, because the answer to a broken superweapon in this universe is always another superweapon, and Archimedes 2 is where it gets truly stupid, in the way only Fallout manages. In Fallout 3, all the way over on the other side of the country, the trigger for that second orbital laser ended up in the hands of a child. A kid in Megaton walks around with a toy called Euclid's Seafinder, a little ray gun he treats like a plaything, and it is in fact a working targeting device wired to a real orbital weapon called the Death Ray, pointed at the sky in the right spot, and an actual beam comes down from space. A child has been carrying the launch key to an orbital superweapon around a shanty town, using it to play soldier. Both of them still work, and the satellite is still up there 200 years later, still loaded and still pointed down. And that's the real horror of Archimedes, because a weapon that ends armies is sitting one terminal password away from anybody curious enough to read the mainframe, and the only thing guarding it is that the wasteland forgot it exists. The NCR is in a shooting war over Helios for the electricity alone. They need the power to light New Vegas and feed their war machine, and they're bleeding men over the switch to something far deadlier than a power plant, and the choice ends up in your hands. Standing at the mainframe, you can route all that energy out to the grid and keep a civilization's lights on, or you can hold it back and keep the weapon primed. One option powers a city, and the other keeps a super weapon loaded. That's the pattern with the old world's worst weapons. The dangerous ones are the ones everybody forgot were still sitting there, loaded, while the wasteland fights over smaller stuff. And the biggest and most popular one of all spent 2 centuries as a rumor under rubble, until an entire faction bet everything on digging it back up. 100-Foot Promise. Liberty Prime is one of the single most powerful weapons ever built in Fallout, and it lost its own war without firing a shot. And understanding why is understanding the whole tragedy of pre-war America. Prime is 100 feet tall, armored so heavily that conventional weapons barely scratch it, carrying 2 eye-mounted energy beams that cut through anything in a backpack of mini nukes. It was commissioned in 2072, and the general running the project, Constantine Chase, described what he wanted with a straight face, a walking, talking, nuke-tossing hero who would remind the world what it meant to be a superpower. The slogans are the tell, because this is a machine that shouts things like, "Death is a preferable alternative to communism while it fights," at full volume, since it was designed to be watched as much as feared. It was never just meant to win Anchorage. It was meant to be filmed winning Anchorage, and it never went, because for all its size and all its firepower, nobody could solve the one problem that mattered, which was finding a way to power the thing reliably. A machine that big, that heavily armed, ate energy faster than any source the era could feed it, and without steady power, Prime was a 100-foot statue. So the Army shelved the most expensive weapon it had ever built and sent men in T-51 power armor to take Anchorage instead. The soldiers won the battle the giant robot was designed for, and Prime sat in the dark under the Pentagon while the world ended around it. 200 years later, the Brotherhood of Steel found it down there, and they were so certain it was their destiny that they claimed the entire Pentagon as their fortress, and named it the Citadel, all on the strength of a broken robot in the basement. And it gets worse. The War Prime was built for Got One without it, and then got turned into propaganda anyway, replayed for 2 centuries as a recruitment simulation, soldiers strapped into like a video game. Then they spent 20 years failing to solve the exact same power problem that beat the United States Army. 20 years of the wasteland's finest engineers, clawing their way up to something like 40% power, which is another way of saying they had a very expensive statue that occasionally blinked. What finally cracked it was one person, a scientist named Madison Lee, who had nothing to do with the military, and who walked in and solved the thing that had defeated an entire pre-war superpower. And the moment they switched it on, it was everything the poster promised. Prime tore the Enclave apart, and for 2 weeks, it was unstoppable, smashing through fortifications while Brotherhood soldiers walked behind it and mopped up, shouting that democracy was non-negotiable while it flattened everything in front of it. And then the Enclave did the one thing that always kills a superweapon in this franchise. They stopped fighting it head-on and got clever. Instead, they lured Prime into a dead end at the Rockland facility, waited for it to punch a hole in the wall for the Brotherhood, and dropped an orbital strike on it from their own satellite platform, the Bradley Hercules. The invincible machine died because somebody made it stand still in the wrong spot. Here's what makes Prime more than a big robot, though, and it's the part the show is clearly building toward. Prime is dumb, structurally dumb, with roughly the reasoning power of a toaster that knows one word, and that word is communist. It can't actually tell a Chinese soldier from anyone else. It just walks forward and destroys whatever it's pointed at, and files the wreckage under Red Menace. That's not a malfunction so much as the design, because the army wanted a weapon simple enough that it could never refuse an order or question a target, and they got one, which is exactly why it's so easy to turn against its own side. When the Brotherhood rebuilds it in Fallout 4, they don't teach it about their new enemies. They just relabel super mutants and raiders and the Institute as communists, because that's the only threat the robot's mind can hold. The rebuilt version is visibly smaller and rougher than the original, because even the Wasteland's best engineers can't fully replicate what the old world threw together and then walked away from. They pointed at the Institute anyway, and let it punch a hole through the ground into their headquarters, because a stupid superweapon aimed at your enemy is still the most persuasive argument in the Wasteland, and the Institute, being some of the smartest people left alive, spot the flaw immediately, side with them, and they feed Prime a lie, tell it the Brotherhood's own airship is a communist target, and the giant obediently shoots its masters out of the sky. The most powerful weapon ever built turned into a murder weapon by a single sentence, because there was never enough of a mind in there to question an order, and the show clearly knows what it's holding. Season 2 ends on the Brotherhood pulling out blueprints for something called Liberty Prime Alpha, which means the single most iconic superweapon in the franchise is being set up as the thing the whole next chapter revolves around. That's the line of every big machine in this franchise. The old world kept building unstoppable power and forgetting to put any judgment behind it, and it built that power at every scale, right down to weapons small enough to leave lying in the dirt, which is the scarier one of the two. Take the most known one of all, a weapon you can sling over your shoulder and fire at a mole rat, and the Wasteland treats it like just another gun. The Fat Man is a shoulder-mounted catapult that hurls a live nuclear device downrange, built so a single soldier could carry an actual nuke, although small in scale, into a fight without a truck or a plane. You find them lying around out there on dead raiders in armories, propped in the corner of a ruin like a broom. The Brotherhood hoards them, super mutants swing them around, and a merchant in Rivet City will sell you one, if you've got the caps. It's the least strategic weapon on this whole list, and that's exactly what earns it a place here, because it's the clearest proof of how casual the old world got about the unthinkable. A weapon designed to level a battlefield became loot, and nobody out there so much as blinks at it. And the darkest version of that idea is a whole town. Megaton in Fallout 3 is a settlement built in a crater around a live, undetonated atomic bomb, with a cult gathered at its base worshipping the thing as a sleeping god. The bomb still works, and early in the game, a man in a suit offers you a stack of caps to arm it and blow the entire town off the map, everyone in it included, because from his tower miles away, the place is spoiling his view. The game lets you push the button, and a community you just spent hours talking to vanishes in a flash you watch from a balcony. That's how normal the end of the world became out here. Erasing a town is a side quest, with a cash reward, but everything so far still needs a person to carry it, aim it, or set it off. But there's one superweapon in Fallout that needs nobody at all. all. Weapon that walks. It's a disease, the most successful weapon the old world ever built, and the only thing on this list that's still spreading 200 years later. The forced evolutionary virus started as exactly the kind of good idea that ends worlds. West Tech, the same company that gave America power armor, was hired by the military to build a virus that would make soldiers stronger, tougher, and immune to biological attack. The horrible part is that it worked exactly as ordered. Dunk a person in a vat of FEV and they come out taller, stronger, radiation-proof and disease-proof. Everything the army asked for. It just also scrubs out most of their mind and leaves them sterile, which is how you get super mutants. An army of walking weapons that were all, every single one of them, a person first. And it doesn't stop working once it's finished with you. A super mutant that keeps mutating for long enough turns into a behemoth, 20 feet of muscle with nothing left inside, no speech and no reasoning, just a body that kept growing until whatever used to think in there got squeezed out. Swan, the behemoth asleep in a pond in the middle of Boston Common, is what the end of that road looks like. He still has a name, which means somebody once knew him well enough to give him one. The original vats sat at Mariposa Military Base in the West Tech facility, the place everyone calls the Glow now, because 2 centuries later it's still radioactive enough to show up as a green smear on the map. That's where the first super mutants got poured out, and the strain kept surfacing everywhere the military had touched it. Vault 87 in the Capitol Wasteland was secretly an FEV testing site, which is why the East Coast has its own separate population of mutants, made from a dirtier strain that barely leaves a mind behind at all. And here's why the FEV belongs at the top of a superweapon list, rather than in a footnote about monsters. Every weapon up to this point has a fixed number, since there were only ever so many Fat Mans, 1 Liberty Prime and 2 Archimedes satellites. FEV makes more of itself, so every vat still running and every super mutant war party dragging fresh humans back to a tank is the weapon reproducing. 2 centuries after the war, it was built for ended. The Master understood this better than anyone and tried to weaponize it on purpose, building an army by feeding California into vats one town at a time. He failed only because the weapon was too good at one thing, sterility. So his master race had no next generation, but the virus itself never stopped. The Enclave took it further than the Master ever did, and they only needed one man to prove it. Frank Horrigan was a Secret Service agent, bodyguard to the Enclave's president, and by every account, a violent piece of work long before any of this happened to him. After some psychotic episode nobody wrote down properly, they bumped him down to Wasteland Patrol, which put him at Mariposa in 2236 while the Enclave was digging the old FEV vats back up. He got exposed, and instead of putting him down, they shipped him back to the oil rig and spent 2 years taking him apart to see what they had. He was sedated for most of it, awake only in short bursts, then dosed on purpose with the Enclave's own modified strain to push the mutation further than it would have gone by itself. What they ended up with stood over 12 feet tall. In 2239, they sealed him inside a suit of power armor built around his body and grafted it on permanently. That suit is his life support, pumping him full of drugs to keep him upright, so the Enclave's deadliest soldier is also its prisoner. They gave him bionic eyes and servos in the arms, and the FEV had knocked his intelligence down far enough that their loyalty conditioning took hold with no resistance at all. Most Enclave soldiers had no idea he was a mutant. They called him a walking nuke, something the tech boys built, and almost nobody volunteered for a mission with him. So an organization whose entire purpose is exterminating mutants built the biggest mutant in the franchise and aimed him at everyone else. The Chosen One finally put him down in 2242, and even torn in half at the waist, he was still talking. Horrigan is the extreme version, but the virus never needed a lab to keep working. It's in the water in places, and in the wildlife. And the centaurs and the Mariposa horrors and half the things that shouldn't exist out there all trace back to a leaked military virus nobody ever contained, and people kept choosing to make more of it on purpose. The Institute, the smartest and best resourced faction left alive, ran their own FEV program under Boston 2 centuries after the war, feeding kidnapped Commonwealth citizens into fresh vats just to study the results. A weapon that should have been buried with the world that made it, and the brightest people in the wasteland restarted it because they wanted to see what would happen. One of their scientists, a man named Virgil, eventually turned the weapon on himself to escape, becoming a super mutant on purpose and then building the only cure the franchise has ever confirmed. Exactly one person out of 2 centuries of victims ever reversed it. Everyone else the FEV touched is still out there, still changed, and the vats that made them mostly still work. And you can't put this one back in the bottle. You can blow up a fat man, dismantle a robot, or wall off a silo, but nobody can unspill a virus that's already in the soil and the water of half a continent and needs nothing from anyone to keep going. That's what makes it the worst thing on this list. 200 years on, it's still out there finding new people to turn into something else. The Red Cloud. There's one other weapon in Fallout that makes more of itself, and it's been sitting on top of a casino in the desert for 200 years. The Sierra Madre was supposed to be the most beautiful place in the world, a luxury resort built by a man named Frederick Sinclair and stuffed with technology nobody else had. The problem was that all of it cost more than he had, so he made a deal with a research company for the holograms, the vending machines, and everything else he wanted. In exchange, the Sierra Madre would double as a testing ground for their prototypes. Sinclair thought he was hosting harmless equipment because nobody told him about the Cloud. The Cloud is an airborne toxin out of a lab called the Z43 Innovative Toxins Plant, and it's the nastiest thing on this entire list to actually stand in. It's blood red, it smells like copper and sulfur, it burns your lungs, and it doesn't need you to breathe it because it goes straight through your skin, and it replicates itself, which means it never runs out and never really clears. Its first victims were the construction workers, back when the villa's cheap ventilation system broke and let the Cloud inside, and the men sent to fix it came back so poisoned they had to cut themselves out of their own hazmat suits with knives. The ones who didn't make it out are still walking around in there. The ghost people of the Sierra Madre are those workers, fused permanently into the suits that were supposed to protect them. Then, the war came, and the Cloud spread over the whole resort and blocked out the sun. It's been there ever since, red and patient, killing anything that wanders in, and 200 years later, a Brotherhood elder named Elijah looked at all that and saw an opportunity. His plan was to harvest the Cloud and use it to wipe out everyone he considered a threat, which is most of the Mojave, a chemical weapon that officially never existed, field-tested on civilians who had no idea they were subjects, and the first man to rediscover it immediately wanted to point it at people. Nobody in this entire franchise ever finds one of these things and decides to bury it. The army under the strip. Not every superweapon in Fallout got left to rot. One man spent 200 years sitting on an arsenal and using it to hold a city together instead of tearing one apart. His name is Robert House, and on the day the bombs fell, he did something nobody else in the entire setting managed, which was shooting them down. 77 warheads were flying at Las Vegas that morning, enough to wipe it off the map like every other city. House had seen it coming for years and spent his whole fortune getting ready for exactly this moment. The instant the launch registered his computer's force-transmitted disarm codes to 59 of those warheads in mid-flight, switching them off in the sky. Laser cannons he'd hidden on the roof of the Lucky 38 tracked and destroyed another 9, 68 nuclear weapons, stopped by one man with the foresight to build a secret missile defense grid and the ego to trust nobody else with it. A few still slipped through and scorched the outskirts, but Vegas lived. Then he did the part that should actually worry you, refusing to stop there. He sealed himself inside a life support pod in the heart of the Lucky 38 and simply refused to die, running the city as a face on a screen for 2 centuries, while he waited for one specific thing to come home. That thing is the Platinum Chip, a little data disk carrying the upgrade software for his real weapon, which was never the lasers at all, but an army. Under the strip, House had been quietly building and storing Securitrons, wheeled combat robots, and the chip turns them from glorified mall cops into a real military force. Hundreds of units carrying rockets and heavy weapons, and the ability to repair themselves. Whoever holds that chip holds that army, and whoever holds that army holds the Mojave, which is the entire reason 4 separate factions spend all of New Vegas at war over one poker chip. Depending on how the courier plays it, that army ends up defending an independent Vegas, or crushing the NCR at Hoover Dam, or getting scrapped entirely, which means the fate of the single largest military force in the region comes down to the errands of one wandering mailman. House waited 2 centuries for that chip, and it had been riding around in a courier's mailbag the whole time, and he's the counter-argument to everything else on this list. Proof that these weapons were never quite the problem on their own. Every other superweapon in Fallout is dangerous because it outlived the one person who understood it. House is the single case where the person understood it perfectly, planned for 200 years, and aimed all that power at survival instead of conquest. He's also proof of how thin that line is because the same arsenal and the same foresight are one bad air away from becoming the biggest threat in the West. And House didn't invent that army himself. He bought the design, because almost everything in this video, the Cloud included, came out of the same crater in the desert, a crater. Most of the horrors in this video have the same return address, a private research campus in the Southwest called the Big Mountain Research and Development Center. The Wasteland calls it the Big Empty, and that name got funnier over time. It was named for the mountain sitting on top of it, and at some point before the war that mountain was simply vaporized, leaving the whole facility sitting exposed in an open cray. Tyr Elijah described the place as a scientific graveyard of old-world misery, which is about as close as anyone's got. Big MT was a defense contractor, and that means everything they built was made to be sold to somebody. They made the Cloud, loud, and they made Saturnite, a metal tough enough that they turned it into artillery shells meant to break the strongest fortifications in the world. A captured piece of Chinese stealth technology went in and came back out as an American stealth suit, which eventually got clever enough to hold a conversation with whoever was wearing it. They built the hologram systems, the hibernation chambers, the explosive collars, and the Securitrons that Mr. House would spend 2 centuries sitting on under the strip. Their X8 labs bolted animals into machines and turned out cyber dogs for police and military work. They improved on the robo-brain and then went further with think tanks, machines running on a real human brain that keeps its personality instead of getting wiped, which is how their own scientists ended up as jars on wheels arguing with each other for 200 years. They spliced rattlesnakes with coyotes to make night stalkers and built cazadores out of wasps, and both got loose and are now a permanent feature of the Mojave that everybody out there has simply learned to live with. And they had a weather station, because Big MT ran experiments on the sky itself. That kind of research needs somewhere to test, so they ran it on a real town full of real people, a place called Hopeville. 200 years later, nobody calls it Hopeville anymore. They call it The Divide, the package. The deadliest superweapon in Fallout was set off by a man who thought he was doing his job, and that's exactly why it's the one that stays with you. Everything else on this list is very loud, and this one was just a delivery. The Divide is a stretch of old military country, studded with silos full of unlaunched nuclear missiles. Warheads the Great War somehow never fired, and on top of those buried nukes, people had built a home, a real community, a town that grew up over the bones of the old weapons, trading and raising kids and slowly turning a graveyard into a place worth living. The Courier, the same character you play as in New Vegas, ran packages through there for years and helped that town thrive. A man named Ulysses watched it happen, another courier who found the Divide and saw in it the first thing in the whole wasteland worth believing in, a community that might actually break the cycle of nations killing each other. He fell in love with the idea of the place, and then he watched it die. What killed it was the last delivery, a package handed off by the NCR who didn't understand what it was and figured the Divide was a safe place to find out. It was a detonator, an old pre-war device tuned to the exact frequency of the missiles sleeping under the town. The courier carried it in, set it down, and left, none the wiser, and behind him, the Divide's own buried arsenal woke up. It tore the region apart, ripping open the earth and leaving the ground so radioactive that the people who stayed stopped being people entirely. They're called the Marked Men now, walking flayed things held together by scar tissue, unable to die and unable to heal, still fighting over ground that killed them a long time ago. It got worse underground because the blast woke up the tunnelers, creatures that breed in the dark and are slowly spreading out of the Divide toward the rest of the West, which means the weapon that ate one town is still out there destroying everything past it. To this day, Ulysses isn't entirely sure the courier didn't know, and that uncertainty is the fuel of the whole story. A man who needs someone to blame for the worst day of his life and has decided on the stranger who carried the box. He's a true believer who lost the single thing he believed in, and he spends the whole journey walking ahead of you, forcing you down the exact road he walked. So you have to see what he saw. He wears a torn pre-war American flag across his back, the banner of a country that ended itself with these same weapons, and by the end, he's ready to hand you the chance to do it all over again. Nobody aimed it, and nobody chose a target, because a weapon that had waited 200 years for a launch order finally got one from a man who was just trying to finish his route. The bombs don't need a villain, they just need to still be there and still work and wait for anyone at all to get close enough. Hold that next to House for a second, because the two of them together are the whole point of this. House sat on his arsenal for 200 years and used it to save a city. The courier passed through the Divide once and erased one without ever knowingly touching a trigger. Same weapons, the same 2 centuries of waiting. The only thing that differed was whether the person standing next to them understood what they were holding. And then the Divide does the cruelest thing of all, which is actually handing you the launcher. At the end of it, standing in the silo the detonator woke up, you get a choice. You can fire the Divide's surviving missiles at the NCR or at Caesar's Legion or at both, or you can turn the weapons on the silo itself and make sure nobody ever uses them again. The game puts you exactly where the old world stood, finger on the same kind of button, and asks the only question that ever really mattered with these things. Now that it's yours, and it still works, what are you going to do with it? So what happened to every superweapon in Fallout? Almost nothing. They're all still there for the taking, and that's the answer nobody wants. The old world built enough destructive power to end civilization several times over, and then civilization ended for other reasons, and the weapons just outlived it. Every one of these things is still out there, still armed, still patient, waiting on the same thing it's always waited on, which is one more person who doesn't understand what they're about to do. If you want to see how the deadliest and most powerful robots robots like Liberty Prime actually work, and why they are dumber than a rock. Click the video on the screen now.